My hands were shaking so badly, I was afraid the wine glass would shatter right there in my grip. I polished the crystal until it squeaked, focusing on the repetitive motion instead of the suffocating silence that had fallen over the dining room. At Nocturne, silence was never a good thing. It meant he was here. Clara, her face pale under the dim, expensive lighting, had whispered the rule to me on my first day, her voice a low, urgent hum. Whatever you do, Lena, don't look him in the eye. He owns everything, sees everything, and hates being seen. He fires people for less. I didn't need to ask who he was. Dante Moretti's presence was a physical weight in the room, a pocket of cold air in the otherwise warm, opulent space. I could feel his gaze from his secluded corner booth, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I kept my own eyes down, staring at the intricate patterns of the silverware, at the crisp white linen, at anything but the shadow in the corner who held my entire fragile world in the palm of his hand. Surviving here meant being invisible, and I had spent the last 6 months trying to perfect the art of becoming a ghost. This job, this city, this life, it was all supposed to be a clean slate, a place where the ghosts of my past couldn't find me. I'd fled my hometown with nothing but a few $100s and a change of clothes, running from a man who wore a badge and treated it like a crown. Detective Evans. Even thinking his name made my stomach clench with a familiar acidic fear. He had promised he would find me, that I belonged to him, and his promises were always threats wrapped in the language of love. The debt I was drowning in wasn't just financial. It was a soul-deep exhaustion from years of looking over my shoulder, of sleeping with one eye open. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my apron, a silent, venomous vibration against my hip. I knew who it was. It's a strange and lonely feeling, knowing the one person who constantly thinks of you is also the one you pray every day to forget. If you've ever felt that kind of isolation, that feeling that you're screaming into a void, maybe you'll understand why stories like this matter. If this one speaks to you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so more people who feel invisible can find a voice here. It truly helps more than you know. I slipped into the alcove near the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs as I pulled out the phone. The screen lit up with a text from an unknown number, but I didn't need a name to know who it was from. The message was short, brutally simple, and it shattered the fragile sense of safety I'd tried to build. I see you in that pretty little uniform, Lena. You can't hide forever. My breath hitched. He was here. Not just in my head, not in my nightmares, but in this city. He was close enough to see me. The opulent restaurant, with its dark wood and velvet curtains, suddenly felt like the most elaborate cage in the world. I could feel the walls closing in, the low murmur of the wealthy patrons turning into a mocking buzz. What could I do? Call the police? He was the police. He knew the system, knew how to twist it, how to make me look like the crazy obsessed one. He'd done it before. I took a deep, shuddering breath, shoved the phone back into my pocket, and forced a placid smile onto my face. I picked up a heavy silver tray, the weight of it a pathetic anchor in the storm raging inside me. Just get through the night, Lena. Just survive until morning. Across the room, Dante Moretti sat untouched by the petty dramas of his patrons. He wasn't eating or drinking. He was simply observing, his presence a study in controlled, predatory stillness. His right-hand man, a severe-looking man named Marco, leaned in occasionally to murmur something, and Dante would respond with a slight nod or a single quiet word, never raising his voice, never needing to. Power like that was terrifying. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was absolute, woven into the very fabric of the place. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire apartment, a stark contrast to my own cheap, sensible black shoes that were already starting to ache. I watched him from the corner of my eye, a dangerous, magnetic force I was supposed to ignore. He was everything I had been taught to fear, a powerful man who operated by his own set of rules, a man who could erase someone like me without a second thought. And yet, there was a discipline in his coldness, an unnerving sense of order in his dark world that was almost hypnotic. He was a different kind of monster than the one hunting me, and I couldn't decide which was worse. The evening shattered when a drunk hedge fund type, celebrating a deal, decided my coworker Maya wasn't smiling enough for him. He grabbed her wrist, his voice slurring as he demanded better service. The manager hovered uselessly, afraid to offend a wealthy client. I saw the flicker of genuine fear in Maya's eyes, a look I knew all too well. Before I even thought about it, I was moving. "Sir," I said, my voice steady and low, placing my hand gently on his arm. "I believe your companion is trying to get your attention." I gestured to his embarrassed wife, giving him an out, a way to save face. He hesitated, then let Maya go with a grunt, turning back to his table. As the manager scurried over to smooth things over, my adrenaline-soaked gaze swept the room, and for one heart-stopping second, it crashed directly into Dante Moretti's. There was no one between us. His eyes weren't angry or cold as I'd expected. They were dark, intense, and shockingly analytical, like he was dissecting me, seeing every frayed nerve and every ounce of forced courage. I had broken the one and only rule, and in his unnerving stillness, I felt the ground beneath me disappear. I spent the next 2 hours waiting for the axe to fall. Every time the manager looked in my direction, my stomach plummeted. Clara wouldn't even meet my gaze, her posture screaming a silent, frustrated, "I told you so." I expected to be called into the back office, to be handed my final paycheck and told never to return. But nothing happened. The silence from Dante's corner was more unnerving than any outburst. He and his men left shortly after the incident, leaving a void in the room that felt almost as heavy as their presence had been. I worked through closing, my movements robotic, my mind replaying that single moment of eye contact over and over. What had he seen? Just as I was wiping down the last table in the empty restaurant, Marco, his consigliere, appeared at my elbow so quietly I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Mr. Moretti was impressed by how you handled the situation with Mr. Albright," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He has a zero-tolerance policy for that kind of behavior in his establishment." It wasn't a compliment or a reassurance. It felt like a statement of fact, a piece of a puzzle I couldn't comprehend, and it left me feeling more exposed than ever. Finally, long after midnight, I pushed open the heavy back door and stepped into the cool, damp air of the service alley. The relief of being free from the restaurant's oppressive atmosphere lasted only a moment. A figure detached itself from the deeper shadows near the dumpsters, blocking my only path to the street. My blood turned to ice. It was him. Detective Evans stood there, his familiar, possessive smirk twisting his features in the dim light. "Did you really think you could just disappear, Lena?" he snarled, closing the distance between us in 2 quick strides. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh like a vice. The smell of stale coffee and bitter rage washed over me. I opened my mouth to scream, to fight, to do anything, but my throat closed up with pure terror. Just as his grip tightened, a new voice sliced through the darkness, low and calm and laced with absolute authority. "Let her go." I dared to look past Evan's shoulder toward the mouth of the alley. Standing there, a perfect silhouette against the distant glow of the streetlights, was Dante Moretti. My past and my present, my nightmare and my enigma had just collided in the darkness. Evans vanished into the night like a phantom, melting away the second Dante's voice cut through the air. Dante didn't move, didn't look at me, but simply gave a short, sharp nod to one of his men who had materialized from the shadows. "See her home?" Dante commanded, his voice a low rumble that carried no warmth, only an unnerving finality. He turned and walked away without another word, disappearing back into the sleek black car that waited at the curb, leaving me trembling in the alley, my arms still throbbing where Evans had gripped it. The ride to my apartment was silent, the man driving a stoic statue behind the wheel. I felt less rescued and more confiscated, like a piece of evidence in a crime I didn't understand. The entire encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had irrevocably tangled the threads of my life. I stumbled into my tiny apartment, locking and deadbolting the door, my back pressed against the wood as I slid to the floor. The fragile wall of invisibility I had built around myself had been shattered, and now I had been seen by two different monsters. I wasn't sure which one scared me more. The next morning, the axe I had been expecting finally fell. I was called into the manager's office before my shift even began. Mr. Dubois, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, couldn't even look me in the eye. He wrung his hands, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. "Lena, I'm so sorry," he stammered, pushing a thin envelope across his polished desk. "We have to let you go. There was an incident, a disturbance. We can't have that kind of element around our clientele." He didn't say Dante's name, and he didn't mention Evans. He didn't have to. The message was clear. I was a liability. I was the problem. I took the envelope, which contained my final week's pay in cash, and walked out without a word. The injustice of it was a bitter pill to swallow. I had been harassed, threatened, and cornered, and I was the one being punished for it. The world suddenly felt impossibly small again, the walls closing in just as they had back home. Nocturne hadn't been a sanctuary, just a prettier cage. Now I was out on the street with dwindling cash, no job, and a predator who knew exactly where to find me. The loss of my job was just the beginning. The very next day, a bright orange eviction notice was slapped onto my apartment door, the stark legal language feeling like a physical blow. My landlord, who had always been so kind, suddenly wouldn't take my calls. I knew Evans was behind it. He was systematically dismantling my life, cutting off every escape route, isolating me until I had no one and nowhere to turn but back to him. His texts became more frequent, more sinister. "Heard you're out of a job. Need someone to take care of you," followed by a picture of my own front door taken just moments before. I stopped sleeping, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every siren in the distance. My tiny apartment, once my only safe space, now felt like a trap. I spent my days scouring online job boards, but my hands shook too much to fill out applications properly. My nights were spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every threat, every possessive smile. He was poisoning my world from the outside in, and I was suffocating, drowning in a fear so profound it felt like it had its own heartbeat, a frantic, desperate drum beating out a rhythm of pure panic. I was down to my last $40 when the knock came. It wasn't the aggressive pounding I expected from Evans, but a calm, measured rhythm that was somehow more intimidating. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I peered through the peephole and my blood ran cold. It was Marco, Dante Moretti's right-hand man, standing patiently in the dingy hallway of my building, looking completely out of place in his impeccably tailored suit. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. He simply waited, and after a full minute of suffocating silence, he spoke, his voice muffled but clear through the wood. "Miss Petrova, Mr. Moretti would like a word. He is waiting in the car." It wasn't a request. It was a summons. I felt a wave of dizzying helplessness wash over me. Running was pointless. Hiding was a joke. I was trapped between a corrupt cop and a mafia boss. With trembling hands, I unbolted the locks, my mind screaming that this was a mistake. Stepping out into the hallway felt like choosing my executioner. Marco said nothing, merely gesturing toward the stairs. In that moment, I knew my life, the one I had so desperately tried to control, was no longer my own. The inside of Dante's car was like another world, all silent, conditioned air and the scent of expensive leather. He sat across from me, his presence filling the small space, making it hard to breathe. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched me with those dark, analytical eyes. He saw the tremor in my hands, the dark circles under my eyes, the sheer exhaustion etched into my face. "Tell me about him," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of command. "The policeman." I shook my head, a reflexive denial. "It's my problem. I can handle it." A flicker of something, impatience maybe, crossed his face. "You were fired. You are being evicted. He is photographing your home. You are not handling it," he stated, laying out the facts of my failure with brutal precision. The clinical way he said it, without pity or judgment, somehow broke through my defenses. A sob escaped my throat, a raw, ugly sound I couldn't hold back. And then it all came pouring out, the years of control, the threats, the way he used his badge as a weapon, the reason I fled, the constant, grinding fear. I told him everything, my voice cracking, the shameful story filling the suffocating silence of the car. As I spoke, Dante's expression remained unchanged, a mask of controlled neutrality, but I saw it in his hands. He rested them on his knee, and his knuckles were white, his fingers clenched into a fist so tight I thought the bones might crack. He wasn't looking at me with sympathy. He was radiating a cold, still fury that was more terrifying than any shouting rage. When I finished, my voice a raw whisper, he was silent for a moment, the engine of the car a low hum around us. "There are lines," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Men who wear a uniform, who take an oath to protect, and then use that power to prey on the people they've sworn to serve. They have crossed a line from which there is no return." There was something personal in his tone, a deep, resonant conviction that went beyond my specific situation. It felt like he was stating a core principle of his universe, a moral absolute in his dark world. He despised bullies, not just because they were cruel, but because they were a corruption of power. In that moment, I understood that my story hadn't just invoked his pity, it had offended his rigid, violent code of honor. He leaned forward slightly, the movement precise and deliberate. "You cannot go back to that apartment. You cannot find a new job without him finding you. You have no resources and no one to call." Each sentence was a nail in the coffin of my independence. "I am offering you a solution," he continued, his gaze intense. "There is an apartment in a building I own. It is secure. No one gets in without my approval. I will also offer you employment, not at the restaurant. You will work for me, personally, organizing records, managing schedules. The work is administrative. The pay will be enough to cover your debts and live comfortably." My mind reeled. It was a lifeline, a gilded one, but it came with a heavy, unspoken price, proximity to him. "You will be safe," he said, and the way he said it made it sound like an unbreakable vow. "But you will be under my protection, which means you will be under my rules." He was offering me a sanctuary that was also a cage, a way out that led directly into the heart of his world. The choice felt both impossible and inevitable, a devil's bargain presented as a simple business proposition. "No," I whispered, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "I can't. I don't want to owe anyone, especially not," I trailed off, not daring to finish the sentence, "especially not you." My entire being screamed in protest. I had just escaped one possessive, powerful man, and I couldn't willingly walk into the arms of another, no matter how different his brand of control seemed. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Moretti, but I have to do this myself. A ghost of a smile, cold and without humor, touched his lips. Your pride is admirable, Lena, but it will get you killed. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. A new text from Evans. Just spoke to your old landlord. Nice guy. He told me all about your financial troubles. Don't worry, I'll always be here to help you. The blood drained from my face. He was everywhere. He had his tentacles wrapped around every part of my old life, and he was squeezing. Dante saw the look on my face. He didn't need to ask. That single message was the final push, the brutal proof that my pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. My independence was an illusion. I had no moves left to make on my own. I looked up from my phone, the screen still glowing with Evans's poison, and met Dante's waiting gaze. The fight went out of me, replaced by a cold, hollow resignation. There was no other way. Survival was the only thing that mattered now, and he was offering the only path to it. Okay, I said, my voice barely audible. I accept. The words felt like a surrender, a final admission that I was not strong enough to win this fight alone. Marco, who had been silent in the driver's seat the entire time, immediately started the car. Go pack a bag, Dante instructed, his tone shifting from negotiation to command. One bag, essentials only. Marco will go with you. Anything else you need will be provided. He wasn't asking. He was telling me how the next chapter of my life would begin. An hour later, I was walking away from my apartment for the last time, a single duffel bag slung over my shoulder, leaving behind the ghost of a life that was never really mine. I was stepping out of one prison and into another, a gilded cage with a far more powerful warden. As the car pulled away, I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The apartment was less a home and more a museum exhibit on the life of a person who valued nothing. It was a cavern of glass and steel overlooking the city, filled with minimalist furniture in shades of gray and black. It was beautiful, sterile, and suffocating. Dante walked me through it, his voice a low monotone as he explained the security protocols. I was not to leave the building without one of his men. The phone he handed me, a sleek, untraceable device, was my only approved contact with the outside world. He had thought of everything, every lock, every camera, every possible contingency to keep me safe. And with each explained feature, the walls seemed to press in closer. It was a gilded cage, just as I had feared. But as I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling city lights, a strange and unwelcome feeling settled in my chest. It was the first time in years I had felt the absence of fear. The silence wasn't empty. It was solid. It was the sound of being untouchable. Then I opened the refrigerator. It was fully stocked with the brand of yogurt I liked and the specific tea I used to drink on my break at Nocturne. He had noticed. The monster had been watching, and he had remembered the details. My new job began the next morning in his home office, a space that was an extension of the man himself, orderly, silent, and intimidating. My task was to digitize decades of old business ledgers from his family's import-export company, a legitimate enterprise that I was sure was merely the clean, public face of a much darker empire. The silence between us was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and simmering resentment. I worked diligently, refusing to give him any reason to find fault, but the proximity was a constant strain on my nerves. I could feel his eyes on me as I worked, his focus as intense and unnerving as it had been in the restaurant. At one point, trying to break the oppressive quiet, I made a flippant remark. So, this is my new life. A high-priced clerk for a man who communicates and glares? He didn't look up from his own work, his voice cutting through the air like a shard of ice. The alternative, he said calmly, was for Detective Evans to find you living in a shelter with no job and no one to hear you scream. If you prefer that arrangement, the door is unlocked. The cold, brutal truth of his words silenced me instantly, leaving a bitter taste of shame in my mouth. He wasn't my friend. He was my keeper. A few nights later, working late to finish a particularly tedious set of ledgers, my fingers brushed against a small rectangular object tucked between the pages of a 1998 accounts book. It was a faded photograph. In it, a much younger Dante, maybe 20 years old, stood with his arm around a smiling, dark-haired woman who shared his intense eyes. Beside them was a teenage girl with a bright, rebellious grin, her arm linked through his. They looked impossibly happy, a family bathed in warm, forgotten sunlight. It was a glimpse of a man I couldn't reconcile with the cold, controlled predator who now watched over my life. Just as I was about to slip it back, his shadow fell over the desk. He had entered the room without a sound. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't name. He plucked the photo from my fingers, his touch surprisingly gentle yet absolute. "You will not go through my personal things again," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that promised consequences I didn't want to imagine. He had built walls around his heart so high I couldn't see the top, and I had just accidentally stumbled upon one of the foundation stones. The next afternoon, the fragile piece of our working arrangement was shattered. Marco arrived, his usual stoic calm replaced by a grim urgency. He spoke to Dante in rapid, low Italian, clearly assuming I wouldn't understand. But working at Nocturne, a place where secrets were often whispered in other languages, I had learned to pick up words. I heard the name Rinaldi repeated several times, a name that tasted like trouble. Then I heard La Ragazza, the girl, and the final, chilling word, debolezza, weakness. I watched Dante's face as he listened, saw his hand clench into a fist on the polished surface of his desk. A flicker of pure, unadulterated violence passed through his eyes, so swift and deadly it made my breath catch. He dismissed Marco with a curt nod, the storm in his expression vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He turned his gaze to me, his face once again an unreadable mask of control. "Is the temperature in here comfortable for you, Lena?" he asked, his voice perfectly even. The whiplash was dizzying. He was discussing my comfort while contemplating murder, and I realized with a sickening lurch that I was no longer just running from my past. I was now standing in the crossfire of his present. The feeling of being trapped became unbearable. The sprawling penthouse, with its panoramic views, felt more like a watchtower than a home. I needed air. I needed to feel the pavement under my own feet, to remember I was a person and not a prized possession. I found Dante in his study and announced, "I'm going for a walk." It wasn't a request. He looked up from his papers, his expression unyielding. "No," he said simply, "it's not safe." I felt a surge of defiant anger, the same reckless courage that had made his eyes in the first place. "I am not a prisoner, Mr. Moretti," I snapped, my voice trembling slightly. "I survived on my own before I met you. I need to walk." He stood up slowly, his height and stillness dominating the room. "You survived," he corrected me, his voice dangerously soft, "but you were not safe. You are under my protection now. Protection has rules. You may walk in the private rooftop garden, one of my men will escort you, or you can walk out the front door and my protection ends. The choice, as always, is yours." He had me cornered with logic and truth, stripping away my anger and leaving only the cold, humiliating reality. My freedom was a price I had already paid for my safety. I expected him to be cold and distant after our confrontation, a silent punishment for my defiance. Instead, the next morning, I found a small potted gardenia sitting on the corner of my workspace in his office. Its white petals were perfect, and its sweet, heavy scent filled the sterile air. There was no card, no explanation. It was just there, a quiet, living presence in a room of cold surfaces and dark wood.
I knew with absolute certainty that it was from him. The gesture was so at odds with the man I thought he was that it left me completely disoriented. Evans used to bring me flowers after he'd been cruel, usually cheap, half-wilted roses that felt like an insult, a token gesture to absolve his guilt. This was different. This wasn't an apology. It felt like a statement. A gardenia was a plant that required care, light, and attention to thrive. It was a promise of something growing, not something dying. I touched one of the soft petals, a strange and dangerous warmth spreading through my chest. He was a man of violence and control, yet he had given me something delicate to nurture. I didn't know how to reconcile the two sides of him, and that uncertainty was more frightening than his anger. The burner phone he'd given me had been silent for weeks, a comforting void where Evans's venomous messages used to be. That evening, it vibrated against the desk with an unfamiliar alert. My heart leapt into my throat, my first thought a cold wave of panic that Evans had somehow found this new number. But the message wasn't from him. It was a picture, grainy and taken from a great distance. It showed my silhouette standing by the penthouse window, looking out at the city. It had been taken that very afternoon. My blood turned to ice as I read the text beneath the image, the words glowing in the dark room. Pretty bird in a gilded cage, the Rinaldis are watching. It wasn't a threat from a lone, obsessed man anymore. This was the cold, professional surveillance of an enemy I didn't know, a rival organization that saw me not as a person, but a strategic weakness. I was a liability.
The safety I had felt, the solid walls and armed guards, all of it evaporated in an instant. I wasn't just Dante Moretti's secret project anymore. I was a target, a flashing red light on his enemy's radar. And I had painted the bullseye on my own back by simply existing in his world. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. Fear warred with a sudden blazing rage. I wasn't just scared, I was furious. I had traded one prison for another, only to find the new one came with a whole new set of monsters. I stormed out of the office and into his study without knocking, thrusting the phone in his face. What is this? Who are the Rinaldis, and why are they sending me pictures of myself? For the briefest of moments, his mask of impenetrable calm cracked. I saw a flash of something primal in his eyes, a violent, protective fury that was directed not at me, but at the unseen threat. He took the phone, his jaw tightening as he read the message. He didn't offer platitudes or try to downplay the danger. "They are a rival family," he stated, his voice like cold steel. "They are opportunists who prey on perceived weakness. They believe you are mine." He paused, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "They are mistaken. But this," he said, tapping the screen, "is why you follow my rules, Lena. This world is not a place for defiance or pride. It is a place for survival. Your safety is not a negotiation." The lecture was infuriating, but the grim finality in his tone told me everything I needed to know. The game had changed. A few days of tense, suffocating silence followed. I stayed away from the windows, feeling watched at all hours. Dante was a constant, brooding presence, his phone calls now hushed and sharp-edged. The illusion of my administrative work was gone. I was now simply the woman he was protecting, a problem he had to solve. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Marco entered the study, his face pale, his usual impeccable composure completely gone. He was carrying a small square box. "Boss, it was left with the concierge," he said, his voice strained. Dante's eyes narrowed. "Lena, stay in the office, lock the door." For once, I didn't argue, but I didn't obey either. I closed the door, but stood pressed against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. I heard the sound of tape being ripped, then a sharp intake of breath from Marco. "What is it?" Dante's voice was dangerously quiet. Marco's reply was a choked whisper.
It's a gardenia. It's been crushed. Then he read the note that came with it. Everything you try to protect will wither and die in your hands, Moretti, starting with her. A wave of nausea and terror washed over me. The threat was no longer a photograph. It was a promise delivered to his front door. They knew where I was, and they knew exactly how to hurt him. The silence that followed the discovery of the crushed gardenia was nothing like the quiet I had grown used to. It was a coiled, violent thing, a predator waiting to strike. Dante didn't speak a word. He simply took the box from Marco, his gaze fixed on the ruined white petals, and a stillness descended over him that was more terrifying than any shout of rage. Within 10 minutes, my life was being packed into two black duffel bags by men who moved with silent military precision. Where are we going? I asked, my voice a useless tremor in the cavernous penthouse. He turned from the window, where he'd been watching the city lights as if mapping out enemy territory. Somewhere they won't think to look. Somewhere from before. His words were clipped, final. I was no longer a project or a responsibility. I was a strategic asset to be secured. The ride was a blur of dark highways, the city shrinking behind us. I felt the weight of his world pressing down on me, the cold reality that the Rinaldis weren't just threatening me to get to him. They were using my very existence to declare war on his honor, and that was a war he had no choice but to fight. We arrived at a sprawling old stone house nestled deep in a thicket of woods, miles from the city's glare. The air here was different, smelling of pine and damp earth. This place felt lived in, haunted by memories, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his penthouse. It was clearly a place he hadn't intended to bring anyone, a sanctuary he was now forced to share. As his men secured the perimeter, Dante led me into a dark, wood-paneled library that smelled of old books and bourbon. He opened a locked cabinet and removed a sleek black handgun, placing it on the polished desk between us. My entire body recoiled. "I can't," I whispered, the sight of it bringing a surge of bile to my throat. "I won't." His eyes, hard as obsidian in the lamplight, met mine. "This is no longer about what you want," he said. "This is about survival. The Rinaldis believe you are my weakness. Tonight, you will learn not to be. I will not have you helpless. I will not lose you to them." The possessive declaration hung in the air, a shocking admission that was both a comfort and a terrifying burden. He was no longer just protecting me. He was fighting to keep me. He took me to the basement, a cold, concrete room with a single bare bulb overhead. The lesson began. He stood behind me, his body a solid wall of heat against my back, his arms coming around me to position my hands on the weapon. The intimacy of the gesture was so profoundly at odds with the cold, deadly purpose of the object in my grip that my mind short-circuited. "Relax your shoulders," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "Feel the weight of it. Respect it. Don't fear it." But I was trembling uncontrollably, the scent of gun oil and his clean, masculine scent mixing into a dizzying cocktail of fear and something else, something I refused to name. The memory I had buried so deep clawed its way to the surface, raw and immediate. "He used to clean his service weapon on the coffee table," I choked out, the words tasting like poison. "After he'd hit me, he'd just sit there, polishing the barrel, not saying a word. It was a promise, a reminder of what he was capable of." My confession, a secret I had never spoken aloud to anyone, filled the cold, empty room with its ugliness. The lesson ended abruptly. Dante took the gun from my nerveless fingers, his movements precise and quiet, and locked it away. He said nothing, but the fury radiating from him was a palpable force, a silent storm directed at the ghost of a man hundreds of miles away. He led me upstairs to the kitchen, the silence between us thick with all the things we couldn't say. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. Instead, he simply made me a cup of tea, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handled the delicate china. As the steam curled between us, he finally spoke, his voice low and rough with an old buried pain. The photo you found in my office, the girl with the rebellious smile, was my sister, Sophia. He stared into his cup, his gaze turned inward, seeing a past I could only imagine. She fell in love with a man everyone approved of, a prosecutor. He had a perfect record and a politician's smile, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He broke her spirit piece by piece until there was nothing left. I didn't see it until it was too late. He looked at me then, the agony in his eyes a mirror of my own. That is why I have my code, Lena. That is why I do not tolerate bullies, and that is why I will not let Evans or the Rinaldis or God himself do to you what he did to her. The attack came just after 3 a.m., not with a crash of gunfire, but with a horrifying, insidious silence. A soft chime from Dante's phone was the only warning. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling me from the chair with a strength that left no room for argument. "They're here," he breathed, his eyes scanning the room, his body a shield in front of mine. He guided me back into the library, his hand firm on my back, and pressed a hidden panel beside a towering bookshelf. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a cramped, pitch-black space. "Inside, now. Do not make a sound." He pushed me gently in and followed, sealing us in total darkness. Seconds later, we heard it. The crunch of glass from a downstairs window, then soft, stealthy footsteps. A voice echoed up the stairs, a sickeningly familiar sing-song tone that turned my blood to ice. "Lena? Oh, Lena, darling, I know you're in here. Your new friend can't hide you forever." It was Evans. He was inside the house, hunting me, and we were trapped in the dark, waiting. The air in the panic room was thick and cold, every breath a cannon blast in the suffocating silence. I could feel a full-blown panic attack clawing at my throat, my lungs refusing to draw air. Evans's footsteps were directly above us now, the floorboards creaking with his weight as he paced the library, taunting me. "Come on out, Lena. We have so much to talk about." My body began to shake violently, the terror so absolute it felt like I was dissolving. Just as a sob threatened to escape, Dante's arms tightened around me, pulling me flush against his chest. His hand came up to cradle the back of my head, his fingers tangling in my hair as his thumb began to stroke my scalp in a slow, steady rhythm. "Shush," he whispered, his lips brushing my ear. "Breathe with me, Lena. Just breathe. I am right here. He will not find you. He will not touch you. I swear it on my sister's memory." The solemnness of his vow, the raw promise laced with his own pain, sliced through my hysteria. I closed my eyes, focusing only on the solid wall of his chest, the steady beat of his heart against my back, and the impossible, undeniable feeling of being completely safe in the arms of the most dangerous man I had ever known. The silence that followed Evans's departure was more unnerving than the noise had been. After what felt like an eternity, we heard Marco's voice call out a coded phrase. Dante unsealed the door, and we stepped out into the wrecked library. Two of his men stood amid the overturned furniture, their faces grim. Evans was gone, having slipped out a back window like the coward he was. But he'd left his mark. On the wall opposite the desk, scrawled in what looked sickeningly like blood, were 7 words that chilled me to the bone. The message wasn't for me. It was a public declaration of war aimed at Dante's reputation, his authority. The Rinaldis and Evans weren't just trying to hurt me to get to him. They were trying to dismantle his entire empire by framing me as the woman who had made him weak, the emotional liability who had compromised the untouchable Dante Moretti. In that moment, I saw the full scope of the disaster I had brought to his door.
My safety had become the very weapon his enemies were using to destroy him. I waited for the inevitable, for him to look at me with cold fury, to tell me I was too much of a risk, to send me away to some other, more distant location where my presence couldn't damage him further. His men were watching him, their faces a mixture of concern and calculation. I was the source of this weakness, this blatant disrespect to their leader. But Dante didn't look at them. He didn't even glance at the bloody message on the wall. He turned to me, his dark eyes searching my face, his expression softening with a concern so profound it stole my breath. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing away a tear I hadn't even realized had fallen. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low rumble intended only for me. It wasn't a strategic question, it was personal. And that single, quiet gesture, in front of his men, with the enemy's challenge bleeding on his wall, he made his choice. He was not ashamed. He was not hiding me. He was protecting me. And in that moment, he wasn't just my keeper. He was my champion. And he was publicly, irrevocably choosing my side in a war he knew could cost him everything. His quiet, protective gesture in the ruined library should have been a comfort, a promise of a united front against the storm I had brought to his door. Instead, it became the prelude to a new kind of hell. In the days that followed, Dante changed. The cold control he once wore as a mask seemed to become his entire being, a chillingly permanent fixture. He was a ghost in his own home, moving through the halls with a silent, predatory focus. His conversations with Marco reduced to clipped, violent whispers in Italian. I was no longer a part of his strategy. I was the source of it, a living, breathing problem he had to manage. The weight of his world, which I had only glimpsed before, now pressed down on me with suffocating force. I saw the strain in the faces of his men, the way they looked at me with a mixture of pity and resentment. I was the chink in Dante Moretti's armor, the bloody message on the wall made flesh, and the guilt was a physical ache in my chest, a constant reminder that my safety was dismantling the very foundations of his empire, piece by agonizing piece. The first real blow landed not on us, but on a part of his world I hadn't even known existed. A fire, they called it on the news, a suspected gas leak at a downtown warehouse district. But I knew better. Marco delivered the news to Dante in the study, his voice stripped of its usual calm. The warehouse was one of theirs, a key distribution point for their legitimate import business. The financial loss was staggering, but that wasn't the worst of it. An elderly night watchman, a man named Sal, who had worked for Dante's father for 40 years, was caught in the blaze. He was in the ICU, with burns over half his body, his survival uncertain. Dante listened to the report without a single flicker of emotion, his face a granite mask. But when Marco left, I saw him go to the window, his back to me, and his shoulders slumped for a fraction of a second, the posture of a king watching his kingdom burn. He didn't have to say a word. I knew he felt every ounce of Sal's pain of his own failure, and I knew with a certainty that made me sick that I was the reason the match had been struck. The next day, while Dante was at the hospital visiting Sal's family, Marco found me in the library. His face was a study in grim resolve, the loyal soldier preparing to commit a necessary treason. "He's not telling you everything," Marco began, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't just about the Rinaldis wanting territory. This is personal. You need to understand the man you've entangled yourself with." He then told me the part of Sophia's story that Dante had omitted.
The prosecutor who had destroyed her, the man who had driven her to take her own life, had been Antony Rinaldi's cousin. Dante had spent years systematically ruining him, but he had never been able to legally connect him to the Rinaldi organization. Dante sees you and he sees a ghost, Marco said, his words like chips of ice. He's not thinking clearly. He's repeating the past, letting a personal obsession put this entire family at risk. His enemies know this. They know you are the key to unlocking his rage, to making him reckless. For the good of this family, he needs to let you go, but he won't, so you have to be the one to leave. His words hit me harder than any physical blow. Every gesture of kindness, every moment of perceived connection, every quiet promise of safety was instantly reframed, twisted into something ugly and unrecognizable. I wasn't Lena. I was a stand in for his dead sister, a tool in his long simmering vendetta against the Rinaldis. The protection he offered wasn't about me at all. It was about his own unresolved guilt, his desperate need to rewrite the ending of a tragedy he could never fix. When he returned from the hospital, his face edged with a grief and fury he tried to hide, I confronted him. My voice was hollow, devoid of the anger he probably expected. Marco told me about your sister, about the Rinaldis. I watched his face shudder, the walls slamming down, locking me out completely. Was I ever a person to you, Dante? Or was I just a ghost you were trying to save? He stood there, the silence stretching between us like a raw, open wound. He couldn't deny it.
He wouldn't lie to me, but the truth was too damning to speak aloud. That silence was my answer, and it shattered the last fragile piece of my heart. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a grim, undeniable necessity. I was the poison. I was the weakness his enemies were exploiting, the emotional trigger that was making a brilliant, controlled man reckless and vulnerable. Staying with him wouldn't keep me safe. It would only ensure his destruction and put more people like Sal in the line of fire. I had to disappear, not just for my own survival, but for his. While he was locked away in his study, making calls that sounded more like declarations of war, I moved through the house like a phantom. I packed the single duffel bag I had arrived with, a pathetic collection of belongings that represented my entire life. On the desk in the office, beside the now wilting gardenia, I left a short, cruel note. I am ending our arrangement. Your protection is a cage I can no longer endure. Forget you ever knew me. Every word was a lie, a carefully crafted betrayal designed to push him away, to make him hate me enough to let me go. It was the only way I could think of to save him from the consequences of his own compassion. Slipping away was easier than I expected. His security was focused on threats coming in, not on a ghost slipping out. I used a service elevator I'd seen the staff use, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs with every silent footstep. I walked for miles through the cold, indifferent city streets, the small roll of cash I had kept hidden from my waitressing days feeling impossibly flimsy. At the central bus station under the flickering fluorescent lights, I bought a one-way ticket to a city I'd only ever seen on a map, a place where I hoped my name and my past would mean nothing. As the bus pulled out of the terminal, the city skyline, dominated by the gleaming tower where Dante's penthouse sat, began to shrink in the grimy window. I felt a wave of loneliness so profound it was like drowning. I had just willingly walked away from the only man who had ever made me feel safe, severing the one connection that had begun to heal me. I had run from Evans to save myself, but I was running from Dante to save him, and the terrible irony of it was a weight that threatened to crush me completely. I made it 3 states away before my world collapsed for the final time. In a cheap, anonymous motel room that smelled of stale smoke and despair, the local news was droning on the small television. I was about to turn it off when a familiar face flashed across the screen. It was Dante, looking grim and powerful in a press photo.
The headline read, "Escalating Gang War Grips City." My blood ran cold. But then the story shifted. The reporter began talking about a major break in the warehouse arson case. An anonymous tip had led police to a key suspect. The photo that appeared next was not of a Rinaldi or some unknown thug. It was Marco. His face was stoic, but his eyes held a look of utter shock as he was led away in handcuffs. I stared at the screen, a horrifying realization dawning on me. They hadn't just attacked Dante's business, they had framed his most loyal man, his brother in all but blood. My running away, my note, my disappearance, it wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was the final devastating blow. I hadn't saved him. I had abandoned him at the precise moment his enemies had managed to isolate him completely, leaving him to fight a war on all fronts, utterly and devastatingly alone. The guilt was a physical thing, a shard of glass in my gut, twisting with every replay of the news report. Marco, the stoic, loyal soldier, being paraded like a common criminal. And it was my fault. I had run, leaving Dante exposed, alone, and wounded at the most critical moment. My cowardice had handed his enemies the perfect weapon. But as I sat there in the buzzing silence of that cheap motel room, the terror and guilt began to curdle into something else, a cold, hard rage. I was done being a victim. I was done being a pawn. I had been running from Evans my entire adult life, and now my running had nearly destroyed the one person who had tried to save me. No more. I couldn't fight the Rinaldis. I didn't have guns or an army. But I had one thing they didn't. I knew Detective Evans. I knew the dark, ugly corners of his mind. He thought I was just a broken toy he could reclaim, but he had forgotten one thing. He had taught me everything there was to know about how a predator thinks, and I was finally ready to use that lesson against him. I bought a cheap burner phone at a gas station and drove for 2 hours to a different town, my mind racing, piecing together fragments of memory. Evans was meticulous about his corruption. He kept records, not on a computer, but in small, coded notebooks he thought no one knew about. He used to brag about it, drunk on power and cheap whiskey, telling me how he was smarter than everyone else. He kept them in a storage unit under his mother's maiden name, a detail I had filed away without realizing its significance. Getting that information to Dante was the problem. A direct call was impossible. Evans would have every line connected to the Moretti Empire tapped. I thought of Clara, the wearied waitress who had first warned me about Dante. She was cynical, but not cruel. I sent a single, untraceable text to her personal phone, a number I'd memorized from the staff roster. Storage Unit 1134, Bluebird Storage, under the name Miller. Tell him it's for Sophia. I added the last part on instinct, a desperate hope that the name of his sister would cut through any suspicion, a password to his grief that only I would know to use. I hit send, then snapped the phone in half and tossed the pieces into a storm drain, my heart hammering. I had just thrown a match into a powder keg, and I had no idea which way the explosion would go. The silence that followed was the most agonizing of my life. For 2 days, I lived on coffee and fear, scanning the news for any sign that my message had gotten through. Then it happened. A small article buried on page 6 of a local news site, Veteran Detective Under Internal Investigation. It mentioned an anonymous tip leading to the discovery of evidence implicating Evans in a long-running extortion ring. It was him. Dante had moved with the silent, devastating speed of a striking cobra. He hadn't just gone for the notebooks. He was dismantling Evans's entire life from the inside out, using the system Evans had so gleefully corrupted against him. The relief was so intense it almost brought me to my knees. But it was short-lived. That evening, a sleek black car I recognized instantly pulled up outside my motel. It wasn't Dante. It was his mother, Isabella Moretti, a woman I had never met. She got out of the car, her posture regal, and her eyes so much like her son's, filled with a terrifying ancient wisdom. She didn't speak. She simply handed me an envelope. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note. He is walking into a trap for you. The Rinaldis have him. Only you know how to save the man from the monster. This key is to the place where he keeps his heart. The address on the note led me to an old, unassuming brownstone in a quiet, historic neighborhood. It was Dante's childhood home, a place he kept exactly as it was when his family was whole. Using the key Isabella had given me, I stepped inside a world preserved in amber, filled with ghosts and memories. In his father's old study, I found what she meant. It wasn't a weapon or a ledger. It was a collection of old case files, newspaper clippings, and private investigator reports, all centered on one man, Antony Rinaldi's cousin, the prosecutor who had destroyed Sophia. Dante had been building a case against him for years, a secret, personal war he waged in the shadows. And at the center of it all was a witness, a young woman who had worked for the prosecutor and had been silenced, paid off by the Rinaldis to disappear. The file contained her new name and her last known address, a small town in Vermont. I finally understood. The Rinaldis hadn't just taken Dante, they were using him as bait to draw out the last loose end that could destroy their family. They were using him to get to her. And I was the only person on Earth who now knew where she was. The final confrontation took place not in a warehouse or a dark alley, but in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room of a rural bus station. I found her there, a woman with haunted eyes named Maria, clutching a ticket and a bag, ready to run again. The Rinaldis were already closing in. I could feel their presence in the cold stares of two men pretending to read newspapers. I didn't have time for a gentle approach. I sat down beside her and spoke his name, the prosecutor's name, and I saw the terror flare in her eyes. "They are coming for you," I said, my voice low and urgent. "And they have the one man who has spent half his life trying to find a way to bring you justice. You can run, and they will hunt you forever. Or you can help me save him, and in doing so, you can finally save yourself." Just as two more of Rinaldi's men began to converge on us, a familiar, authoritative voice cut through the air. "That will be far enough." Marco, looking haggard but free, stood at the entrance, flanked by several of Dante's men. The trap had been sprung, but not the one the Rinaldis had intended. My message had been a diversion, a breadcrumb that allowed Dante's real plan to unfold. He had sacrificed himself as bait to give me time to do the one thing he couldn't, convince a terrified victim to finally find her courage. Dante was waiting for me back at the old house. He wasn't bruised or broken, but the exhaustion in his eyes told a story of a war fought on 1,000 different fronts. With Maria's testimony, combined with the evidence from Evans's notebooks, the entire Rinaldi empire was collapsing under the weight of a federal investigation. The charges against Marco had been dropped, and Evans was facing a future in a prison where his badge meant nothing. All the pieces were falling into place. The war was over. We stood in the quiet library, the air thick with unspoken words. He had risked everything, his life and his freedom, on the belief that I would understand his plan, that I would not run this time. "I knew you were the only one who could reach her," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She needed to see that it was possible to face a monster and survive. She needed to see you." He stepped closer, his gaze intense, searching my face. "I'm not offering you protection anymore, Lena. I'm not offering you a safe house. I am asking you to stay, to build a life with me."
To be my partner. There were no more ghosts between us, no more debts to be paid. I reached up, my hand tracing the line of his jaw, and for the first time, I looked him in the eye and saw not a mafia boss, but my home. "I'm not going anywhere," I promised. And as the morning sun streamed through the window, I knew it was a vow we would keep. If our story has shown you that even in the darkest of places, a light of hope can be found, please share it so others can feel that same warmth. 6 months passed in a blur of headlines and quiet rebuilding. The Rinaldi organization crumbled under the weight of federal indictments, their empire of fear dismantled by Maria's courage and the contents of Evans's sordid little notebooks. Evans himself was a ghost now, a name in a court docket, his power reduced to a memory that was finally beginning to fade. The silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was filled with the sounds of a new life. Nocturne reopened, but it was different. We kept the name, but I worked with Dante to strip away the oppressive darkness, replacing the heavy velvet with softer textures and warmer light. It was no longer a place where powerful men hid in the shadows. It was a place that celebrated being seen. I wasn't a waitress there anymore. I was a partner, my name on the business license right below his. The staff, including a much happier Clara, no longer walked on eggshells. They smiled, they laughed, and when Dante walked in, he wasn't a terrifying enigma in the corner. He was the man who came to have dinner with me, his eyes, once so cold and analytical, now seeking mine across the room with a warmth that was just for me. My role in his world became something I never could have imagined. I wasn't just a project he had saved. I was a voice he listened to, a perspective he actively sought. We spent hours in the old brownstone, not as a safe house, but as a project of our own, transforming it from a museum of his family's past into a home for our future. He'd spread blueprints across the massive library desk, and instead of ledgers filled with dark secrets, we debated paint colors and the placement of a garden. I was thinking we could put a fountain here, he said one afternoon, his finger tracing a spot on the plans for the backyard. But what do you think? The question was simple, but it held the weight of everything I had ever wanted, to have my opinion matter, to be seen as an equal. I remembered a life where my thoughts were dismissed, where my voice was a nuisance to be silenced. I think, I said, leaning against him, that a fountain would be beautiful, but I want it to be surrounded by gardenias. He turned his head, his lips brushing my temple. As many as you want, he promised. The fear that had been my constant companion for years began to recede, leaving behind a quiet strength I didn't know I possessed. The nightmares still came sometimes, echoes of a past that would never be completely erased, but they no longer had the power to destroy me. When I woke up shaking, Dante was there, his arms a solid, comforting presence in the dark, his steady breathing a lullaby that chased the monsters away. He never pushed me to talk about it, but he always knew. He'd hold me until the trembling stopped, his touch a silent promise that I was no longer alone in the fight. We built a life in the small moments, making coffee together in the morning sun, his hand finding mine as we walked down the street, the comfortable silence as we read side by side in the evenings. He had once been a man defined by his rigid codes and emotional detachment, a king in a lonely castle of his own making. But with me, he was just Dante, a man who had learned that true strength wasn't in being untouchable, but in having someone worth touching, someone worth fighting for. One evening, we were standing on the newly finished terrace of our home, the scent of blooming gardenias rising from the garden below. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a world away from the quiet peace we had built. Dante turned to me, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his touch as tender as it was sure. "Everyone told you not to look me in the eye," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. I smiled, my heart full to bursting, and met his gaze without a trace of the fear that had once defined me. In his eyes, I saw no monster, no mafia boss, only the man who had broken every rule he had for me, the man who had shown me that a safe harbor could be found in the most dangerous of storms. This was our second chance, a future built from the ashes of our pasts. And as he leaned in to kiss me, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that the story of the broken waitress and the feared mafia boss was finally over. And the story of Lena and Dante was just beginning.